This is an iPhone 7 audio IC repair. As you can see in the voice memos, the record button is grayed out. If Siri can't hear you or you're having sound problems during phone calls, there's a good chance that one of the contacts underneath the audio IC has lost its connection. So what we're going to do is start by peeling back this little plastic sticker that covers up that area on the back side of the logic board. And I like to start this with a razor blade. Some people don't like the idea of using a razor blade. I'll remind everyone this one has been slightly dulled down, so it's a little less likely you're going to slice through something accidentally. And I really only use it to get started. And once you do, after you've applied some heat, it's pretty easy to peel these off in one piece so that you can put them back on after you finish. Of course, the heat also helps you to reapply the sticker. We'll set our heat sink down on the NAND, and then we're going to come in with some heat. I did apply a small amount of flux earlier. I'm not doing that quite as often anymore. It's really still kind of questionable as to whether or not that makes a difference when you're removing something, but I imagine it really can't hurt, and we're going to put some flux on here once we get this thing off anyways. So it did take me probably, I want to say, about a good 45 seconds or so to heat this off. On my hot air station, I come in pretty close, so I've got my temperature set at 375 and my airflow is at 30. That will, of course, vary according to the equipment that you're using and how far away from the board you're working. So you notice that I do get into the camera here quite a bit because I've got this thing really up close, and that seems to work for me. You know, people have different techniques, but I prefer to try to isolate the heat as much as possible so that we don't warm up anything else in the process. Now, once this comes off, and if I didn't mention it, I usually look for a slight wiggling motion left and right before I actually lift the chip. We don't want to pull this thing off. We want it to just kind of almost come off on its own with very little effort. And then we'll go ahead and apply some flux here. And I'm going to put a ball of solder on the end of my iron. I like to use the slanted tip that's flat, as you can see. It'll just create a little bubble and kind of go over these, not touching the surface with the soldering iron. I'm only touching it with the ball of solder that's on the end so that we can go over this hopefully one time and smooth these out a little bit. This is also going to help remove any oxidation, and as you can see, I did reorientate the board because it's kind of tough to get into these corners if you're always working at the same angle. But I would caution you not to work these too much, because the hotter you get them, obviously the greater risk you're going to have at having something just kind of melt off, and then you have created a new problem you have to deal with. So we'll wipe this down, get it nice and clean so we can see what's going on here, and then we'll get ready to install our jumper. I've already applied a small amount of solder to the end of the wire so that it burned off the non-conductive coating, and then that way we can just set this down here with a bit of flux. And you don't need a whole lot of heat, obviously, because these things are so small. So I just want to kind of tack it in place for the moment up against the top side there. And then as you can see, I just touched it onto that third pad, which is the C12. That is the one that appears to be the problematic one that causes issues with the phone booting up. And we'll go ahead and break that off right at the end of the pad. And then I'm going to clean this up enough so that we can get inside here and have a dry surface to work with. And I'm going to use some UV curable solder mask. And I'm actually using my fine-tipped tweezers to apply this. I've tried squirting this out and using all sorts of other things, and you just need a very small amount, because if you put this on too thick, it doesn't dry very well, or it may not dry at all. So just enough to kind of coat the wire. You can see it kind of ran over the area that I'm working on there. That's going to be plenty. We'll put that under the UV lamp for now. And meanwhile, we're going to clean up this chip. So we will put some flux down and get a soldering iron and just kind of go over this very lightly. We don't want to spend a lot of time with heat on this, obviously, but we want to get these pads somewhat evened out. And again, hopefully remove any oxidation that's on the surface so that when we apply the new solder, it will stick and we won't have any problems with this developing over time. And once you get this so that it's looking decent, we'll go ahead and wipe it down with a swab. It's a little tricky to hold this thing in place. I've actually got my tweezers on the side out of the camera shot. I didn't realize I was zoomed in quite this far, so I'll probably end up making another one of these videos in the future, but they all go pretty much the same way. We want to get these nice and, you know, somewhat flat. Again, don't spend too much time heating them up or you can cause some damage there. Once you do get it to where you're satisfied, we'll put this face up on a piece of Kapton. I don't always do that anymore. I did it quite a bit in the past, and I'm finding I don't really think that that's necessary. But if it helps to hold it up against the stencil that you're using, go ahead and do that. I've since started using the 3D stencils, and they're a little easier to work with, but with some practice here, I think you can get to the point where you don't really need to have that thing taped against the back. And as you can see, I did put a small amount of flux, even though the solder paste is supposed to have flux in it. I find that if you put a small amount of flux down before you apply this, it makes the chip a lot easier to remove. So I'm just going to work this into the holes so that everything is filled up nice and evenly. We want to make sure we have the same amount of solder paste in every hole. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and redo these and remove or add here and there, and that just adds to the time on your project. So once you've got it somewhat evened out, we want to scrape off everything from the surface of the stencil so that none of that stuff runs into those holes, because what you'll end up is having a couple of these balls that are bigger than the other, and then that's obviously going to make the chip sit unevenly. And again, adding to the time on your project where you have to take that off, go in, smooth it out, and put it back on, and you know, it's just repeat the whole process for all practical purposes. Now I turned my heat down to 325. I've still got my airflow on 30 here, and again, what you want to do is heat these nice and slow and evenly, and just kind of work your way across. And as soon as they melt, you can stop with the heat. It doesn't take a whole lot to get these to melt, and then wait until they turn back to sort of an opaque color so that you know that they've fully cooled down. Take your fine tip tweezers, and if you push on a couple of these holes, the chip should fall right out. If it doesn't, it's probably melted to the stencil, or you didn't have enough flux. I mean, it would take an entire video for me to really describe this process in detail, and I'll probably end up doing that later on. But for now, I just wanted to demonstrate the removal, running the jumper, and then reinstalling the IC. And yes, the audio IC is typically not damaged unless something happened, or it's, you know, the phone's got severe physical damage, or you broke it in the process of taking it off. So you should be able to reuse this. If you take a look at the adjacent components, you can kind of get an idea of how to align this thing pretty close to where it needs to sit, and we want to make sure that it is in the right position and in the right orientation, of course. And if you heat this up a little bit as you're sort of manipulating it, moving it around, you'll find that it'll sort of stick at a certain point. And when it does, you shouldn't need the tweezers as much until it finally settles, and then you just do a slight movement to make sure it's sitting on top of the balls properly. So we're just going to continue to heat this for a couple more seconds, and you can see it's pretty much lining up at this point. You'll want to watch here. I know I'm sort of blocking the camera a bit, so I'm going to show this twice, but watch the chip. If you didn't see it wiggle just now, I put it in slow motion for a second take, and you see it just shift there. And when it does, that was because it sat down on the balls. I gave it a small nudge to make sure that it bounced back into position, and now we are aligned properly. So we'll go ahead and clean all of this up. It's much easier to get the flux off, obviously, when the board's a little warm. Once it cools, it gets kind of sticky. So I would do that as soon as possible. All right, so here is our cool looking red iPhone, and we'll try voice memos again. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, looks like we're recording. Let's go ahead and play that back on the speaker. Well, you can't hear that, can you? There we go. Let's try that again. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so that is good. And what else do we have? Siri, what time is it?
I wish I could help, but you don't seem to be connected to the internet.
You can't tell me what time it is because I'm not connected to the internet yet. It says 4:06. So anyway, Siri seems to be working, audio seems to be working, and that's it. We're ready to go. If you found the video helpful, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and check out our weekly Tech Talk live stream. Have a great one, and thanks for watching.